Thank you for having me at DGT. What I'd like to talk about today is the general election recap. Obviously, it didn't go well as the last couple times I've done this presentation, but I really wanted to highlight where the voter shifts happened, not only in Pima County, but in AZ06 and in LD17. Those are the two competitive districts in the county. But first, for those who don't know who I am, I'm a data strategist. I mostly do digital advertising with Uplift Campaigns. I was the voter file manager for the state Democratic Party. Prior to that, I worked for a little county party called the Pima County Democrats. That's where I got my start in Arizona politics. That was back in 2008. I've clearly stuck with that for much longer than most people have. While I was at the Democratic Party, I learned how to visualize data and explain trends and things like that. Let's dive into this, but let's first look at Pima County. So first thing that we want to look at is party registration. And the general trend is registration goes up over time since 2012 over here. The big shift that I saw, not only in Pima County, but statewide in pretty much every legislative district, congressional district, is there is this big spike in Democratic registration. You can see it here on this bottom chart. From 2018 to 2020, Democrats added almost 44,000 voters in Pima County. After that, registration dropped off. It dropped off for Democrats and Republicans evenly. Independents added some in 2022. But the big shift here is that from 2022 to 2024, Democrats lost 205 voters and Republicans added 13,000. Independents grew even larger, 24,000. That's the big shift that we saw. A lot of the registration that was happening in the state was by Republicans. Dem voters, the vote share since 2020, 41% of all voters in Pima County were registered Democrats. That dropped 3.5% to just under 37% in 2024. And it was largely made up by this increase in independent vote share. It looks like Republicans were about flat. The other thing that I keep an eye on is Dem versus GOP registration advantage. This is fun for me. Usually these bars down here are red because I'm looking at a competitive district where Republicans have the advantage. But still here, there's a big drop in Democratic registration advantage, down from 71,000 to 58,000. That doesn't swing the county red or anything like that, but it does help explain this big statewide shift. Larry has a question: what caused the spike in GOP registration? Obviously, there's some dissatisfaction with the Biden administration. I think that we have to acknowledge that. While we all in this room recognize the excellent work that they did with the CHIPS Act, among other things, the inflation was pretty wild those last couple of years of the term. That led to an increase in probably independent and GOP registration. The other thing is, I don't know if the C3 and C4 groups did a lot of that voter registration that they have done in the past. Charlie Kirk registered a lot of new Republicans. That was a big push here in Arizona, especially among younger males. That led to an increased push where we didn't see that on the Democratic side for whatever reason. This next slide here, this is similar to that registration slide, but this is turnout, voter turnout, who showed up at the polls. And these lines, they go up and down every 2 years. The down years, this is a midterm election. Voter turnout falls in a midterm. That's very normal to see. Presidentials are higher. What is interesting about this is in 2018, 2020, since 2018 on, Democratic turnout has been on par with Republican turnout. That's a newer trend here, and it's great to see that. Of course, when we look statewide, we saw a similar trend, but because Republicans increased their registration numbers statewide, even if we were matching them in turnout, we just don't have the raw numbers as the Democrats to overcome that deficit. This green line here, this is overall turnout for the county. And then the gray line, of course, is independents. They are always performing below what the two parties do. That's just how independents operate. The other thing here, very similar to our registration trends over here, in 2020, 44% of all voters in Pima County were registered Democrats. That dropped to 40% in 2020. That gain was made up a little bit by Republicans, but mostly by independents who turned out and voted. The Democratic voter advantage in 2020 was about 60,000. That dropped 13,000 voters down to 47,000 voter advantage in 2024. So you can see that the total voters, we had fewer than in 2020 by about 20,000, but the Republicans only dropped about 4,000 in that same time. Independents increased about 9,000. Something I want to highlight here is the Pima County voter shift. 2022 was, I think, an anomaly for Democrats. We overperformed. A big issue that year was the Roe v. Wade overturning, and a lot of our strategies around that worked very well. In 2024, we had I think it was Prop 139, the enshrining right to an abortion in the Constitution. That was on the ballot. That passed easily. But we didn't see that trickle down to other Democratic candidates. 2024 saw a regression not only from 2022, but from 2020. In 2020, Joe Biden got about 58% of the vote. In 2024, Harris got just under 57% of the vote. So that's a fairly small shift overall. Your neighbor to the south, Santa Cruz County, had the biggest shift. Democratic performance, presidential, dropped, I think, about 8% from 2020 to 2024, just signaling where the Democratic Party is having trouble. A lot of it has to do with Hispanic, Latino populations, but even more, and this has been a bigger trend for a longer time, is this urban, suburban areas where Democrats have been doing well. It's not translating to the rural areas. We are not capturing that sort of vote. Something else I want to break out is by legislative district. So down here, these legislative districts, District 19 to 20, they're not in numerical order, they're in performance order. So District 19, this is the lowest Democratic vote share here, and then 20 is the highest. Most of these districts, 19, 17, 16, 18, they all performed relatively similar in 2020 and 2024. Where you see the big shifts happening is on these south and west side districts of 21, 23, and 20, where 21 drops 4%, 23 drops 5%, and then a bigger drop here in District 20 dropped 4%. And we're still winning those districts overall, but what's happening is that a portion of those votes are going Republican. But really what it's come down to is this big push by Republicans to register more voters. This next slide, this is a big shift. There's a lot of different arrows for all the precincts in Pima County. You don't have to look at each one of them, but I want to explain what's happening on this map. So if you take the results in 2022 and you go to 2020, almost every precinct in Pima County shifted blue. The darker the arrow here, this is a very dark arrow, the bigger the arrow, the bigger the shift. But every single precinct, except for a handful of these smaller precincts, they shifted blue. But if you compare 2020 to 2024 over here, that shifted back red. And you can see most of this shift is happening in the south and west part of Pima County, or Tucson, South Tucson area. Where it's not happening as much, and I find this really interesting, is up here in LD 17, where of course there was a successful single shot candidate. One of the two successful legislative pickups or holds that we had in the state, the other one being up here in North Phoenix, Maricopa County. While these precincts here in the south and west side are still Democratic, instead of going 75% Democratic, they're now going 67% or 65% Democratic. So there is definitely a GOP shift happening in these areas of town. Okay, let's talk about AZ06 next. You're going to see a lot of these slides repeated from the Pima County numbers, but they're going to be specific to AZ06. And of course, this includes all the other counties, Cochise, Graham, Greenlee, and Pinal. So again, GOP has always had a registration advantage in this district. And I should note that I am taking the previous district, either if it was 8 or 2, and I've moved those precinct numbers over into the current district. And that's how I can look back, even though this district has only been around for 2 cycles. But again, this trend of registrations increasing to about 2020, Democrats, again, flatline, even go down in registrations from 2020, while independents and Republicans increase their vote share. Here, 33% of registered voters were Democrats in 2020, and then 30% of Democrats were registered in 2024. Independents, again, making up a bigger share of that shift, about 3% increase here. Republicans were a little flat, but I think that's due to this increase in independent registration. Again, down here, you can see that from 2022 to 2024, Democrats added just 450 voters. Republicans added 11,000. When you look at it from 2020, Democrats actually lose about 4,000 voters from 2020. What's really telling is this registration advantage. In 2022, this race was incredibly close with Engel and Juan Ciscomani. It was largely in part to this registration advantage of only 19,000. That increased 38% from 2020, going from 22,000 advantage to 30,000 advantage. The next thing I want to talk about is turnout by party. And again, this is very similar to the Pima County numbers. Obviously, Pima County making up the greater vote share of AZ06. What's really interesting here is that Democratic turnout is almost always ahead, or they're either ahead or virtually tied with Republican turnout. And that's something we see a lot in our competitive districts. You'll see that in LD17. Having that be tied is great. But again, if you think about the registration slide that we showed last, the numbers are just not there for the Democrats. This bottom slide down here, the voter advantage, this one is incredibly telling to me because in 2022, obviously, as I mentioned, the race was incredibly close. You all saw that. It wasn't called right away. Republicans only had an advantage of about 13,000. That number doubled right away to just under 26,000. So that is a big change. Voter registration increased 89% since 2002. Independent voters made up 2.5% larger vote share. That came at the expense of Democrats and Republicans. I'm going to bring up the party shift map. I zoomed into Tucson because there actually wasn't too much movement in Cochise, Graham, and Greenlee counties. They all remained relatively flat. They didn't have this shift that we saw. And this shift here from 2020 to 2022, I'm just looking at the congressional numbers. Again, we saw this big shift to the Democratic side. This core of Tucson around the Sam Hughes area, the East Tucson here, even up into here into Oro Valley, Marana area. That number evaporated once it came to 2024. It was a big shift back to what we saw. I was up in Saddlebrook a couple weeks ago. Saddlebrook has never been known as a hotbed of progressive politics, but in both elections, 2022 and 2024, they shifted left. That is, I never thought I'd see that in Saddlebrook. So it is interesting to see that trend happening. The other thing that I want to say here is the Congressional Democrat 2020, 2022 performed virtually the same, maybe a little bit less in 2022. Same thing for the Republican, all 3 years, right around that 50% mark. But as you can see, there was a third-party Green candidate that took votes away from the Democrat more than the Republican. That is very notable, having that 2% shift go to a green candidate. Last, I'm going to do the LD17 recap here. Again, these same slides here. Registration went up a little bit. I think this is the one competitive district where Democratic registration increases. Technically, it doesn't go up very much. As you can see, we have about 28% of registered voters as Democrats in 2024. And then in 2020, it was higher at 30%. Registration advantage increased to almost 19,000 for GOP voters. Independent voters increased their vote share about 2% since 2022. And GOP registration advantage has increased 9% since 2020. Next up is the turnout. This is crazy. This is one of the few districts where Democrats had over 90% turnout, which is incredibly high. There's actually a precinct up in Saddlebrook that had 97% Democratic turnout. So turnout in this district is excellent for all parties. Even independents are performing above the county average. And what we saw is that Democrats decreased their vote share from 32% to 30%. GOP voters increased their advantage, or independents did. And then they also increased their voter advantage from 2022 to 2024. The big difference was the single shot. But this shows that the single shot is effective. It is an effective strategy, and it should be used in, I think, probably more of our districts. The districts that had a single shot, I'm going to start in the upper left here, LD2, LD16, and LD17 all had single shot candidates. LD16, that candidate did not come through, but LD2 and LD17 won. And I want to explain how I'm using the percentage first. If you look on the Secretary of State's website, you're going to see that the state house candidates get anywhere from 30 to 25% of the vote based on being 3 or 4 candidates. I changed that a little bit so I can compare them to how the two-way races are doing, like a Ruben Gallego or a Kamala Harris. The math is that I take the State House 1 votes and I divide it by State House 1 Democrat plus State House 2 Republican. So I'm just comparing State House, the top Democrat versus the second Republican. And I do that because you only have to beat 1 to get in. And that gives me a percentage closer to 50%, so I can compare them to other candidates. And what these dots mean here, this bright orange dot, this is State House 1. And you can see that it goes up and down depending on the district. But what I like to look at here is how does it compare to Ruben Gallego or Kamala Harris? And Ruben Gallego is this green dot here. He was our top performing Democrat in the state. And you can see in these single shot districts, LD 17, 16, and 2, our state house candidate is either on par or even overperforming Ruben Gallego's percentage. And that's because of the power of the single shot. If you look at LD 13, which is Maricopa County, look at the distance between where Ruben Gallego performed and our top state house candidate. And that's because there were 2 candidates there. Not forcing the choice of people who want to split their ticket really can have an impact there. The other district that we ran 2 candidates in is LD 23. And you can see that there's another big gap between this green Ruben Gallego dot and the State House 1 dot. And that's because the Republicans did a single shot strategy, and that siphoned votes away from our purple dot here, which is our state house candidate. If you look at all of our LDs with only 1 Democratic candidate running for House, on average, the state house Democratic candidate got 42% of the vote. Now, of course, when you're thinking about a single shot district, we're running a lot of times in Republican heavy districts, a lot of times in unwinnable districts. So this percentage is going to be low, but that doesn't really matter because when you compare it to how Ruben Gallego did, they are slightly, just technically, overperforming where Ruben Gallego did by 0.2%. And this is a state house candidate. They're overperforming what Harris did by almost or 3.5%. When you look at districts with two candidates, and of course, this includes a lot of our deep blue districts, your LD 18, your LD 20s, there is a drop off. State House 1 is underperforming the top candidate of Gallego, and it's only overperforming Harris by just over 2%. So while these numbers aren't huge, it's not a huge shift from one to the other. In a competitive district, 500, 1,000 votes, that can flip the whole seat right there. That's the end of my presentation here. I'm going to open it up for questions. Of course, yes, the presentation will be shared. If you have any questions that you think of later, you are welcome to email me here. You can also find me on the socials on Blue Sky over here.
Hey, great presentation, Sam.
Larry Wagner's got his hand up. Go ahead, Larry.
Thank you. Sam, you had in the lower left-hand corner of one of your slides, vote changes or registration changes in LD 17. Could you talk to that a minute?
You're talking about this slide down here?
Registration change by party
Yeah.
LD 17.
What this bottom chart shows is the difference from 2020 or the previous year to the difference between this spot and this spot. So from 2012 to 2014, Democrats reduced their registration by about 1,400 voters. The big change came in 2020. COVID happened. People had nothing to do. So they're like, well, I might as well register and vote. From 2018 to 2020, Democrats added about 9,900 voters during that time. But since then, it hasn't changed as much as the Republicans had. The Republicans did lose 1,400 voters in 2022, but they added 4,400 from 2022 to 2024. That's this increase here.
Thanks for that. Our understanding has always been we've got a very narrow headway for voter registration, but that shows that the GOP is doing it. So
yes,
maybe we ought to look at it again.
Absolutely. It is tricky in these competitive districts, especially in LD 17, where you have a higher socioeconomic voter where a lot of them simply register when they get their driver's license. It's not really an extra step that they take. They're very used to voting. You saw that the turnout for Republicans, Democrats were upwards of 90%. So while there is room for additional voter registration, the persuasion and the single shot that you all have been running up there has just been spectacular.
Okay, Susie Anderson has a question for you.
Hi, Sam. Do you have any information about our young voters? The U of A has finally gotten a bigger group than they've had in a number of years. Do you have any information about what's happening with those who are new to voting and how we're doing there?
I don't yet, but young voters don't vote early as often. They usually show up on election day. So I don't have the huge percentages of it. I know that generally speaking, voters age 65 plus make up close to half of all the voters going into election day. But that's going to drop a little bit. We do see that people who registered to vote in 2024, you're more likely to vote than had you registered in 2022 and never have voted. Generally speaking, younger voters under 24 make up less than 5% of all voters. Under 35, I think, make up maybe closer to 10 or 12%. So it isn't a huge segment of voters that are younger that show up in Arizona.
Okay, we've got Bill Shipp is up next. Bill, what's your question?
My question is about voter turnout. And one of the things that I saw in Dallas was that Democratic turnout was horrible. And as a percentage of registered voters, it was absolutely horrible in this last election. Do you have any explanation of why we did so much better?
What we saw here is that turnout was a little bit down from 2020, and that's to be expected. 2020 was a record high turnout, but it was down like 2 or 3%. What we saw is that Democratic turnout wasn't the problem. For years, we've had this problem of Democratic turnout where we're just trying to get our voters to the polls. Here, we didn't have enough Democrats to turn out. And that was an opposite problem of what we've had for at least 3 or 4 election cycles. And I think part of that, of course, is Arizona's early voting. It is incredibly popular. We usually get about 80% of all ballots back before Election Day. That might have dropped a little bit closer to 70, 75% just because of the presidential election. Higher turnout elections will have a larger share on early ballots. For instance, the 414 election, I would expect 90% of the ballots have already been cast at this point.
Okay, Barathan.
I really have one question. If you look at the registration of the Republicans and the independents, it seems to me that a substantial part of the decline of Democratic registration has happened because of a move away of registered Democrats to becoming independents. And that probably reflected itself in the turnout too. Am I right?
That's a great question. I have looked at this in the past of party switchers. What I've found is it's usually a smaller number than what we want to see has switched. I'm sure there are a lot of Democrats that maybe switched from Democratic to independent for whatever reason. I expect that number grew from 2022 to 2024. But again, it's still overall pretty small, and these voters still carry their same voting habits. Just because you have no party next to your name, you don't necessarily completely shift your values over to the Republican Party. I'm sure that happens, but not in huge amounts. But that is absolutely something that we look at, and I think it's really interesting.
I think one of the issues might be that those who shifted away, even if a small number, from Democrat to Independent probably stayed away from the vote, which probably also registered itself in the lower turnout.
Yeah, absolutely. There were fewer voters. Turnout was a little bit lower. And when you're looking at a swing state like Arizona, a 2% drop in Democratic turnout, that flips the whole state. So but when we're dealing with such small margins here in Arizona, a small change like that can really move things.
Okay, you have a question.
I was wondering about the people that switched parties to vote for Nikki Haley in order to vote against Trump, whether that has some sort of an impact on the data.
It's going to be really small. You'd have to switch from independent to Republican to vote in that preference election. It's not that much, honestly. And then even if they do fail to switch back or anything like that, I don't think it's going to overcome this voter registration push that you saw the GOP have statewide. The state party uses the same data set that I use. I share with their canvas because they do give me access to some of the DNC stuff. So I share a little bit back and forth with them. The legislative caucus, I'll give them a little bit of information. They do have to reach out and contact me, but I'm happy to provide it.
Okay, Mike, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think we've covered all the questions in the chat. Barathon didn't exactly ask straight on the question that he asked in the chat. And he said pushing single candidates, even in marginal districts, doesn't help when we want to get the majority in the state house.
That is a tricky question because you still have to get to 31 somehow. I think if you look at LD 16 with Keith Seaman, I think that was an anomaly in 2022 to have him slip through. So we're looking at that as a loss. In LD 23, that district to West Pima County, Yuma, Maricopa, that should be a Democratic seat because the Republicans doing a single shot. And there are opportunities up in Maricopa County. We actually lost, I think, 2 or 3 seats up here where having that single shot, if we had just won one of those, we might be looking at a tied legislature or even a tied Senate. It's a little bit trickier with the Senate. You do have to expand your map a little bit when it comes to that. My working theory that is completely untested is that if you have your State House 1 candidate consistently finishing as the top vote getter, you want to start thinking about adding a second candidate. That worked well in a Phoenix district up here. It was in Ahwatukee, South Phoenix, the cul-de-sac area of Phoenix. They got one in, they won't top vote getter a couple cycles, and now that it is a completely blue district, it's difficult to flip the legislature in one cycle, and strategy does matter on it.
Sam, I wanted to thank you for such a great analysis of the single shot. But I think it's a strategy where it's hard to have a marketing plan to convince Democratic voters to just vote for one.
So this is interesting. So the Maricopa County in 2022, I was able to get the cast vote record so I could see how each individual ballot voted. Of course, it's not tied to an individual or anything. But what I found was that in basically ballots that voted a straight Democratic ticket at the top, Hobbs, Kelly, Fontes, Hoffman, about 90% of those only voted for one Democratic candidate and no Republicans. So it's not as big of a lift as we may think, but it is a lift. It is unusual to say, okay, throw away one of your votes, because we were never taught that in civics class.
Yeah. But those strong Democrats, I think, can be pretty easily persuaded to never vote for a Republican, period, even if they have an extra vote. It would burn my hand if I voted for a Republican.
So are we going to be studying Ruben Gallego's victory for years to come?
No, because that one's easy. Kerry Lake's a bad candidate.
That's what I thought. But I still think there's something to learn. It's pretty awesome that he was able to really not run on his record so much, really reinvent himself.
He did that. For those of you who've been around a while, he did George W. Bush. Like, he's a guy I want to have a beer with. That really resonated a lot in some of the rural areas. Obviously, a lot with Latino men. They see that, they recognize what he's doing, and he doesn't speak the hard progressive Dem that we see in some of our other candidates.
Just an FYI, he's been killing it on social media since. His communication strategy on social media is really very engaging. But you have a substantial team and a substantial brain trust there at Uplift. I'm wondering what lessons you've taken away, you and your team have taken away from this cycle that you're going to be applying and telling clients come next cycle.
Sure. I'm going to shift. This is like a completely different topic. My work at Uplift really revolves around digital ads. What we found is that if you are a congressional candidate, statewide candidate, investing more in digital TV is the way to go. People are cutting their cords. That's not to say ignore mail and broadcast TV, but thinking about other ways of reaching voters is key. The other thing that we're doing, this idea of one-to-one targeting, especially on digital ads, it might not be the way to go. We might not be able to match exactly our voters, so we need to cast a wider net online more broadly. Even if we are reaching voters that we don't necessarily want to contact, that aren't getting our mail or a knock on the door, by expanding your universe and not using direct digital matching techniques, you are able to capture more of the voters that you want, even though you are including some that you don't. That was our big takeaway this cycle.
In terms of what's proven effective in the digital ad space, where are you suggesting that clients spend their money? People have their noses to their phone and a computer all the time. But what channels are you reaching them through most effectively?
We actually built a lot of tools to help that based on your audience. For instance, if you're trying to reach Hispanic Latino populations, YouTube is the way to go. That population watches that channel more than broadcast or CTV.
I know, I certainly do.
And when I say CTV, I'm talking about like a streaming service like Paramount Plus or Roku or something like that. But it really depends. If you're looking for an older demographic, you might want to lean a little bit more towards Facebook. A younger demographic, It's a little limited because TikTok, you can't do political advertising. Snapchat, nobody's really on that one, but you can include those channels as ways to reach your voters. But nothing beats organic content, genuine organic content. You can throw up a paid ad, but people know what an ad looks like. We skip ads all the time.
Kevin Volk knocked on 4,600 doors to win. And it
It's
seemed like we had
6,400.
more broadcast television ads than I've ever seen. And how effective were those?
That's great. I think Kevin being in the Tucson market, it was a lot easier to spend there. It's a little bit cheaper than Phoenix. And you're still getting a good chunk of people who still watch broadcast television. And I'm sure the ADLCC did a very strong digital program to back that up as well.
All right. Seeing no further questions in the chat and no hands up. Other than that, thanks a lot, Sam. It was a very enlightening and interesting presentation today. Thanks.
Big round of applause for
All
Sam.
right.
What a great
Thank you,
program.
Sam. Thank you all.
Really
Appreciate it.